Justice delayed and justice denied, the reckoning. I am Allison with Allison Knows. Hello to my know it alls. Hello to all my allies. We are wrapping up the three part on Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going ahead to offer out, you know, an opportunity to ask questions if you like. I am a social commentator. This that I am sharing with you is for information purposes. And my hope is that it will stimulate in you a want and a curiosity to get answers. And I think we can only benefit from getting answers of the truth. Right now, I'm going to finish up my report that I put together. I worked on a lot and I'll read it to you and then we will see where we are. So, continuing. In 2005, everything began to unravel for Epstein. A parent in Palm Beach reported to police that Jeffrey Epstein had sexually abused her 14-year-old daughter. What followed was an investigation that would ultimately identify 36 girls, some as young as 14, whom Epstein had allegedly sexually abused. But here's where the story becomes a case study on how wealth and power can corrupt the justice system itself. Instead of facing federal charges that could have put him away for life, Epstein was allowed to plead guilty to state charges of procuring a child for prostitution and soliciting a prostitute. He served just 13 months in a county jail with extensive work release privileges that allowed him to leave the facility up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. This wasn't justice. This was a carefully orchestrated cover up facilitated by some of the most powerful lawyers in America and blessed by federal prosecutors who should have known better. The deal was outrageous. It was an obvious, inadequate plea deal that will later be ruled illegal by a federal judge. But Epstein didn't just escape serious consequences, he thrived. He continued to operate his trafficking network. He continued to abuse young women. He continued to maintain relationships with powerful people who either didn't know about his crimes or didn't care. And through it all, there was one constant: the silence of those who knew. The wealthy friends who had attended his parties, the powerful men who had flown on his plane, the politicians who had taken his money, the business leaders who had done deals with him. Where were they when the victims needed them to speak up? Where were they when justice was being perverted? Where were they when a serial predator was being allowed to continue his crimes? The final act: death in a cell. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again, this time on federal charges of sexual trafficking of minors in Florida and New York. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The victims were ready to testify. After more than a decade of impunity, it seemed like justice might finally be served. However, on August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correction Center in Manhattan. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging, but the circumstances surrounding his death have fueled conspiracy theories and raised serious questions about the competence or complicity of those charges with keeping him alive. Here's what we know. Epstein was supposed to be on suicide watch, but he had been removed from that status just days before his death. His cellmate had been transferred, leaving him alone. The guards, who were supposed to be checking in on him every 30 minutes, had fallen asleep and falsified records. The cameras that should have recorded his final hours malfunctioned. In July 2025, today is July 13th, the Department of Justice released footage from Epstein's final hours, but telling 1 minute of footage was missing from the time when Epstein died. 1 minute. In a case this sensitive, in a facility this secure, how does 1 minute of footage simply disappear? Michael Wolff, who had spent those 100 hours listening to Epstein's insights and observations, He put it best, quote, "Here are these two guys, both driven by a need to do anything they wanted with women, dominance and submission and entertainment. And one of them ends up in the darkest prison in the country and the other in the White House." End of quote. The cover up continues, but Epstein's death didn't end the story. In many ways, it has intensified the story. According to Google right now, Epstein's name and information has been searched over 12,000 times. Because now, instead of facing a trial where victims could confront their abuser, the full scope of his network could be exposed, we are left with questions, speculations, and a growing sense that powerful people are still being protected. And nowhere is this more evident than in the current administration, which I call a regime, handling of the so-called Epstein files. During his campaign, Trump promised transparency. His Attorney General Bondi pledged to release all of the information the government holds on Epstein. I wonder why that didn't happen. Maybe it turns out that the list has more of Trump than less of Trump. But what have we gotten instead? On February 2025, Bondi invited a selected group of pro-Trump influencers to the White House and handed them binders containing what she called phase one of the document release. That content had phone book contacts and flight logs, most of which have been publicly available since 2015. Meanwhile, Elon Musk, once one of Trump's closest allies, has publicly accused the president of being named in the still sealed Epstein files. The accusation has created a spectacular rift between two of the most powerful men in America, with Trump claiming that Musk has, quote unquote, Trump derangement syndrome, and Musk insisting that Trump only won the election because of his support. More to follow on that. But here's what's really telling. Instead of simply releasing the files and putting the speculation to rest, the Trump regime has chosen to engage in a war of words, to attack the credibility of those asking questions, to deflect and delay and obfuscate. Why? What are they hiding? What are they protecting? Now, the lessons that we must learn as we reach the end of this story, it's a story that is far from over. We need to ask ourselves some very hard questions about what the Epstein case tells us about power, privilege, and accountability in America today. First, it tells us that wealth can buy not just luxury and comfort, but impunity. Epstein operated his trafficking network for decades and in plain sight, with the knowledge and sometimes participation of some of the most powerful people in America. He did this because he understood that in our system, if you have enough money and the right connections, you can get away with almost anything. Second, it tells us that our justice system is not blind. It sees wealth, it sees power, it sees influence, and it adjusts accordingly. The 2008 plea deal that allowed Epstein to escape serious consequences wasn't an aberration. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to work, protecting the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Third, it tells us that silence is complicity. Every person who knew that Epstein was doing and said nothing, every person who attended his parties and asked no question, every person who took his money and looked the other way, they all bear responsibility for the continued suffering of his victims. And finally, it tells us that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. Michael Wolff's tapes, the court documents, the victim testimonies, the flight logs, piece by piece, the full scope of Epstein's operation is being revealed. And with each revelation, the web of complicity becomes clearer. Now, be on the lookout for Rosie O'Donnell Be on the lookout for independent media. Be on the lookout for more of us asking questions like this. And it's not just on this topic, it's on other topics that are working at being very, very vocal on and about. The questions that remain. Tonight, we've traced the arc of Jeffrey Epstein's life and crimes from his humble beginnings in Brooklyn to his death in a Manhattan jail cell. We have examined his relationships with powerful people, including Donald Trump. We have looked at how Ghislaine Maxwell enabled his crimes. We have seen how wealth and power can corrupt justice itself. But the story isn't over. There are still questions that demand answers. There are still files that remain sealed. There are still powerful people who have never been held accountable for their roles in enabling one of the most prolific sex traffickers in American history. As long as those questions remain unanswered, as long as those files remain sealed, as long as those people remain protected, the victims of Jeffrey Epstein will not have justice. And without justice for them, there can be no justice for any of us. Because in the end, the Epstein case isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about a system that allowed those crimes to continue, that protected the perpetrator, that silenced the victims, and that continues to shield the powerful from the consequences of their actions. That system is still in place. Those protections are still operating. And until we confront that reality, until we demand real accountability, until we insist that wealth and power cannot buy impunity, we will continue to live in a country where justice is not blind, but bought and sold to the highest bidder. This has been a special episode of Allison Knows. I am Allison. I will see you next time.